Vincent Price is often remembered as the lacquered prince of American Gothic horror, and it's easy to forget how wide his range was and how often he stepped across the Atlantic, literally and artistically, to work with British talent. The Telegraph piece today reminds us of something that perhaps people might have forgotten. Price was not only the voice from the coffin or the smiling sadistic effigy in the House of Wax. He was educated, funny, strangely gentle, a collector, a cook, and for purposes today, a man who once stood on a Broadway stage opposite a young Patricia Routledge and tried to sing a Stein show. That's where the paths of these two unlikely partners crossed. His reputation became Gothic height. Hers was still forming and would become comedic excellence. The show they shared was Darling of the Day in 1968, adapted from an Arnold Bennett play with music by Stein and lyrics by Yip Harburg, who had written Over the Rainbow. On paper it ought to have run for years. In practice it ran for 31 performances. Yet it left behind something precious. It gave Routledge her Tony Award, it gave Price his one and only Broadway musical, and it preserved, on the cast album, a moment where the king of horror allowed himself to be light. So starting with Price, the Telegraph piece lingers on Tim Burton's almost filial devotion to him. Burton had watched those Poe films in Californian suburbia and found in Price a figure who carried loneliness without complaining about it. That is what makes Price so moving, for example, in Edward Scissorhands. And by 1990, he was frail, Parkinson's had thinned him, yet he still projected a courtly kindness. Burton cast him not as a monster, but as the maker of a monster, a kind of elderly Prospero in a lab coat, and it was his last big screen appearance. So the scene where he tries to give Edward hands and collapses now feels like an act of farewell. He also provided the thunderously brilliant voice in Dick Williams' film The Thief and the Cobbler of Zigzag. But to go back to Tim Burton, what's interesting is the late tenderness is not an accident. It sits on top of an earlier theatre instinct where that the horror films partly obscured. Before he was Mr. Phibes, the wonderful Dr. Phibes, Mr. Phibes Rises Again. Price was Priam Phaal in Darling of the Day, playing a shy genius who paints on stage, who swaps identities with his dead valet so that he can escape the burden of fame. The role needs urbanity, timing, and the ability to stand next to a powerhouse comedian and not disappear. Enter Patricia Routledge. Routledge, whose funeral in the cathedral today in Chichester was so carefully constructed, was a different kind of perfectionist. The obituary material in the service and the tribute from the clergy underlined two things. First, she was exacting. Second, she believed in communication as a moral act. Project, articulate, make yourself understood because words matter. That's exactly what she brought to Darling of the Day. The New York critics more or less said the same thing at the time. The show was uneven, the book was fussy, the plot was froth. But Patricia Routledge walks on and the air changes. Her pub number, Not on Your Nelly, kicks the evening into life. She sings, she drinks, she plays the room, and suddenly the material looks better than it is. So, this curious artistic snapshot from 1968, a Hollywood horror star, slightly miscast, trying to be ingratiating, a British character actress, not yet Hyacinth Bouquet, not yet Hetty Wainthropp, showing New York that she can carry a Broadway score. The show failed, but the partnership is worth remembering precisely because today we are mourning her and recalling him. There is irony here. Price was sometimes accused of being too bland in the part, too eager to be liked. Nunnally Johnson wanted something sharper, more Beecham, more acid. Price, who in film could do menace with a single eyebrow, chose warmth on stage. Routledge, by contrast, who on screen later became the terror of the English cul-de-sac, was on that stage expansive, generous, playful. In other words, they swapped what history now says they did best. He, the supposed villain, became mild. She, the supposed busybody of Middle England, was the life of the evening. That's a rather touching inversion to note on the day her life is being commended in a cathedral. The obituary material from the service reminds us that Routledge was serious about sacred space as well, about good speaking, about choosing her readings. Ecclesiastes and the Beatitudes are not accidental choices. They're texts about time, reversals, the vindication of the overlooked. It's not forced to connect that to Darling of the Day. The musical is about a man who tries to vanish into ordinary life and a woman who makes the ordinary splendid. That is Routledge's signature. She finds the gleam in what looks domestic: Hyacinth arranging the flowers, Hetty Wainthrop taking a case that no one else wants, Alice Chalice marrying a man she believes is a valet and treating him as if he is worth the world. It is the same artistic instinct. Honour the small thing, do it properly, speak it clearly. Set that beside Vincent Price's broader career and you see another point of contact. Price spent a lifetime lifting material that he could so easily have trashed. The Fly, The House on the Haunted Hill, Fibes. He knew some of it was cheesy. He laughed on set. Yet he played it with style, with that unmissable voice. Routledge did the same for British television, writing 3 decades later. Keeping up appearances is funny, but it is her exact social temperament that makes it immortal. Both Price and Routledge, both of them had the knack of treating popular work as if it deserved first-class craft, and they gave it first-class craft. The Telegraph article on Price reminds us too that he was not a narrow man. Yale, London theatre in the 1930s, devoted to Gielgud, friends among the literati, an art museum that still bears his name, cookbooks, even a television cookery show for ITV. This is another quiet echo with Routledge, who spent her later years doing carefully curated performance talks, supporting music, insisting that young actors learn to speak properly. Both were more cultured than their most famous roles. Both had long memories for art. Both liked Britain. Both combined camp and seriousness. So how do we speak of them both together today? I would suggest this: Darling of the Day, which history flies under flop, is in fact the hinge that lets us remember Vincent Price not as a single genre figure and Patricia Routledge not only as Hyacinth. It shows Price saying yes to musical theatre at 56 in a role others would have turned down. It shows Routledge conquering Broadway in one leap. It fixes them in the same room with the same score under the same critical eye. And now, when a cathedral prays for her and a newspaper revisits him, we can set the stories side by side and see a kind of theatrical communion. It's worth imagining how Price, with his amused Anglophilia, would have enjoyed the tone of the funeral address, clear-shaped, slightly wry, alert to language. He once said you could make friends with a dead man. It turns out that you can also make friends across time. Today, a British cathedral gives thanks for a woman who once kept a Broadway musical alive opposite the King of Horror. Today, a British reader revisits the actor whom Tim Burton loved like a mentor. They met in 1968 in a show about escaping fame. More than half a century later, they are both being remembered for doing exactly the opposite. They made themselves equally unforgettable.